This is the story of the Maccabees, the story of Hanukkah, told in English. It came to pass, after that Alexander the Macedonian, the son of Philip, who came out of the land of Chittim, and struck Darius king of the Persians and Medes. It came to pass, after he had struck him, that he reigned in his stead in former time over Greece. And he fought many battles, and won many strongholds, and killed the kings of the earth, and went through to the ends of the earth, and took spoils of a multitude of nations. And the earth was quiet before him, and he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up. And he gathered together an exceedingly strong army, and ruled over countries and nations and principalities, and they became tributary to him. And after these things he fell sick, and perceived that he should die. And he called his servants which were honourable, which had been brought up with him from his youth, and he divided to them his kingdom, while he was yet alive. And Alexander reigned 12 years, and he died. And his servants bare rule each one in his place. And they did all put diadems upon themselves after that he was dead. And so did their sons after them many years. And they multiplied evils in the earth. And there came forth out of them a sinful root, Antiochus Ephanes, son of Antiochus the king, who had been a hostage at Rome, and he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days came there forth out of Israel transgressors of the law, and persuaded many, saying, Let's go and make a covenant with the Gentiles that are round about us, for since we are parted from them, many evils have befallen us. And the saying was good in their eyes, and certain of the people were forward herein, and went to the king, and he gave them license to do after the ordinances of the Gentiles. And they built a place of exercise in Jerusalem, according to the laws of the Gentiles, and they made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the Gentiles, and sold themselves to do evil. And the kingdom was well ordered in the sight of Antiochus, and he thought to reign over Egypt, that he might reign over the two kingdoms. And he entered into Egypt with a great multitude, with chariots, and with elephants, and with horsemen, and with a great navy. And he made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt. And Ptolemy was put to shame before him and fled, and many fell wounded to death. And they got possession of the strong cities in the land of Egypt, and he took the spoils of Egypt. And Antiochus, after he had struck Egypt, returned in the 143rd year, and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered presumptuously into the sanctuary, and took the golden altar, and the candlestick of the light, and all that pertained thereto, and the table of the showbread, and the cups to pour withal, and the bowls, and the golden censers, and the veil, and the crowns, and the adorning of gold which was on the face of the temple, and he peeled it all off. And he took the silver and the gold and the precious vessels, and he took the hidden treasures which he found. And when he had taken all, he went away into his own land, and he made a great slaughter, and spoke very presumptuously. And there came great mourning upon Israel, in every place where they were, and the rulers and elders groaned. The virgins and young men were made feeble, and the beauty of the women were changed. Every bridegroom took up lamentation. She that sat in the marriage chamber was in heaviness, and the land was moved for the inhabitants thereof, and all the house of Jacob was clothed with shame. And after 2 full years, the king sent a chief collective tribute to the cities of Judah, and he came to Jerusalem with a great multitude, and he spoke words of peace to them subtilely. And they gave him credence, and he fell upon the city suddenly, and struck it very sore, and destroyed much people out of Israel. And he took the spoils of the city, and set it on fire, and pulled down the houses thereof, and the walls thereof on every side. And they led captive the women and the children, and the cattle they took in possession. And they built the city of David with a great and strong wall, with strong towers, and it became to them a citadel. And they put there a sinful nation, transgressors of the law, and they strengthened themselves therein. And they stored up arms and food, and gathering together the spoils of Jerusalem, they laid them up there, and they became a sore snare, and it became a place to lie in wait, and against the sanctuary, and an evil adversary in Israel continually. And they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary, and defiled the sanctuary, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them, and she became a habitation of strangers, and she became strange to those who were born in her, and her children forsook her. Her sanctuary was laid waste like a wilderness. Her feasts turned into mourning, her Shabbats into reproach, her honor into contempt. According to her glory, so was her dishonor multiplied, and her high estate was turned into mourning. And King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that each should forsake his own laws, and all the nations agreed according to the word of the king. And many of Israel consented to his worship, and sacrificed to the idols, and profaned the Shabbat. And the king sent letters by the hand of messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow laws strange to the land, and should forbid whole burnt offerings, and sacrifice and drink offerings in the sanctuary, and should profane the Shabbats and feasts, and pollute the sanctuary and those who were holy, that they should build altars and temples and shrines for idols, and should sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts, and that they should leave their sons uncircumcised, that they should make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation, so that they might forget the law and change all the ordinances. And whoever shall not do according to the word of the king, he shall die. According to all these words wrote he to his whole kingdom, and he appointed overseers over all the people. And he commanded the cities of Judah to sacrifice city by city, and from the people were gathered together to them many, every one that had forsaken the Lord, and they did evil things in the land. And they made Israel to hide themselves in every place of refuge which they had. And on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they built an abomination of desolation upon the altar. And in the cities of Judah on every side, they built idol altars, and at the doors of the houses and in the streets they burned incense, and they tore in pieces the books of the law which they found, and set them on fire. And wherever was found with any a book of the covenant, and if any consented to the law, the king's sentence delivered him to death. Thus did they and their might to Israel, to those that were found month by month in the cities. And on the 25th day of the month, they sacrificed upon the idol altar of God, and the women that had circumcised their children they put to death according to the commandment, and they hanged their babes about their necks, and destroyed their houses, and those who had circumcised them. And many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat unclean things. And they chose to die, that they might not be defiled with the meats, and that they might not profane the holy covenant. And they died, and there came exceedingly great wrath upon Israel. In those days rose up Matthias, the son of John, the son of Simeon, a priest of the sons of Joarib, from Jerusalem, and he lived at Modin. And he had 5 sons, John, who was surnamed Gaddis, Simon, who was called Thassi, Judas, who was called Maccabees, Eleazar, who was called Avaran, Jonathan, who was called Apophos. And he saw that the blasphemies that were committed in Judah and in Jerusalem, and he said, Woe is me! Wherefore was I born to see the destruction of my people, and the destruction of the holy city, and to dwell there, when it was given into the hand of the enemy, the sanctuary into the hand of aliens? Her temple is become as a man that was glorious. Her vessels of glory are carried away into captivity. Her infants are slain in her streets, her young men with the sword of the enemy. What nation has not inherited her palaces, and has gotten possession of her spoils? Her adorning is all taken away. Instead of a free woman, she has become a bondwoman. And behold, our holy things, and our beauty, and our glory are laid waste, and the Gentiles have profaned them. Wherefore should we live any longer? And Matthias and his sons tore their clothes, and put on sackcloth, and mourned exceedingly. And the king's officers that were enforced in the apostasy came into the city Modin to sacrifice, and many of Israel came to them, and Matthias and his sons were gathered together. And the king's officers answered and spoke to Matthias, saying, You are a ruler and an honorable and a great man in this city, and strengthened with sons and kindred. Now therefore come you first, and do the commandment of the king, as all the nations have done. and the men of Judah, and those who remain in Jerusalem. And you and your house shall be in the number of the king's friends, and you and your sons shall be honored with silver and gold and many gifts. And Matthias answered and said with a loud voice, If all the nations that are in the house of the king's dominion listen to him, to fall away each one from the worship of his fathers, and have made choice to follow his commandments, yet I and my sons and my kindred will walk in the covenant of our fathers. Heaven forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not listen to the king's words to go aside from our worship on the right hand or on the left. And when he had left speaking these words, there came a Jew in the sight of all to sacrifice on the altar, which was at Modin, according to the king's commandments. And Matthias saw it, and his zeal was kindled, and his reins trembled. And he showed forth his wrath according to judgment, and ran and killed upon the altar. And the king's officer, who compelled men to sacrifice, he killed at that time, and pulled down the altar. And he was zealous for the law, even as Phinehas did to Zimri, the son of Salu. And Matthias cried out in the city with a loud voice, saying, Whoever is zealous for the law and maintains the covenant, let him come forth after me. And he and his sons fled into the mountains and forsook all that they had in the city. Then many that sought after justice and judgment went down into the wilderness to dwell there, they and their sons and their wives and their cattle, because evils were multiplied upon them. And it was told the king's officers and the forces that were in Jerusalem, the city of David, that certain men who had broken the king's commandment were gone down into the secret places in the wilderness. And many pursued after them, and having overtaken them, they encamped against them, and set the battle in array against them on the Shabbat day. And they said to them, Thus far come forth, and do according to the word of the king, and ye shall live. And they said, We will not come forth, neither will we do the word of the king, to profane the Shabbat day. And they hurried to give them battle, and they answered them not, neither cast they a stone at them, nor stopped up their secret places, saying, Let us die all in our innocency. Heaven and earth witness over us, that you put us to death without trial. And they rose up against him in battle on the Shabbat, and they died, they and their wives and their children and their cattle, to the number of 1,000 souls. And Matthias and his friends knew it, and they mourned over them exceedingly. And one said to another, If we all do as our kindred have done, and fight not against the Gentiles for our lives and our ordinances, they will now quickly destroy us from off the earth. And they took counsel on that day, saying, Whoever shall come against us to battle on the Shabbat day, let's fight against him, and we shall in no wise all die, as our kindred died in the secret places. Then were gathered together to them a company of Hazadeans, mighty men of Israel, every one that offered himself willingly for the Lord. And all those who fled from the evils were added to them, and became a stay to them. And they mustered an army, and struck sinners in their anger, and lawless men in their wrath. And the rest fled to the Gentiles for safety. And Matthias and his friends went round about, and pulled down the altars, and they circumcised by force the children that were uncircumcised, as many as they found in the coasts of Israel. And they pursued after the sons of pride, and the work prospered in their hand. And they rescued the law out of the hand of the Gentiles and out of the hand of the kings, neither suffered they the sinner to triumph. And the days of Matthias drew near that he should die, and he said to his sons, Now have pride and rebuke gotten strength, and a season of overthrow, and wrath of indignation. And now, my children, be you zealous for the law, and give your lives for the covenant of your fathers, and call to remembrance the deeds of our fathers which they did in their generations, and receive great glory and an everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful in temptation, and it was reckoned to him for righteousness? Joseph, in the time of his distress, kept the commandment, and became Lord of Egypt. Phinehas our father, for he was zealous exceedingly, obtained the covenant of an everlasting priesthood. Joshua, for fulfilling the word, became a judge in Israel. Caleb, for bearing a witness in the congregation, obtained a heritage in the land. David, for being merciful, inherited the throne of the kingdom for ever and ever. Elijah, for he was exceedingly zealous for the Lord, was taken up into heaven. Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael believed and was saved out of the flame. Daniel, for his innocency, was delivered from the mouth of lions. And thus consider you, from generation to generation, that none that put their trust in him shall lack for strength. And be not afraid of the words of a sinful man, for his glory shall be dung and worms. Today he shall be lifted up, and tomorrow he shall in no wise be found, because he is returned to his dust. And his thought is perished. And you, my children, be strong, and show yourselves men in behalf of the Lord, for therein shall you obtain glory. And behold, Simon your brother, I know that he is a man of counsel. Give ear to him always, he shall be a father to you. And Judas Maccabees, he has been strong and mighty from his youth. He shall be your captain, and shall fight the battle of the people, and take you to you all the doers of the law, and avenge the wrong of your people. Render a recompense to the Gentiles, and take heed to the commandments of the Lord. And he blessed them, and was gathered to his fathers. And he died in the 146th year, and his sons buried him in the sepulchres of his fathers at Modin, and all Israel made great lamentation for him. And his son Judas, who was called Maccabees, rose up in his stead, and all his kindred helped him, and so did all those who clave to his father. And they fought with gladness the battle of Israel. And he got his people great glory, and put on a breastplate as a giant, and girded his warlike harness about him, and set battles in array, protecting the army with his sword. And he was like a lion in his steeds, and as a lion's whelp roaring for prey. And he pursued the lawless, seeking them out, and he burned up those that troubled his people. And the lawless shrunk for fear of him, and all the workers of lawlessness were so troubled, and salvation prospered in his hand. And he angered many kings, and made Jacob glad with his axe, and his memorial is blessed forever. And he went about among the cities of Judah, and destroyed the ungodly out of the land, and turned away wrath from Israel. And he was renowned to the utmost part of the earth, and he gathered together such as were ready to perish. And Apollonius gathered the Gentiles together, and a great army from Samaria, to fight against Israel. And Judas perceived it, and he went forth to meet him, and struck him, and killed him. And many fell wounded to death, and the rest fled. And they took their spoils, and Judah took the sword of Apollonius, and therewith he fought all his days. And Sauron, the commander of the army of Syria, heard say that Judas had gathered a gathering, and a congregation of faithful men with him, and of such as went out to war. And he said, I will make myself a name, and get me glory in the kingdom, and I will fight against Judas, and those who are with him, that set at nothing the word of the king. And there went up with him also a mighty army of the ungodly to help him, to take vengeance on the children of Israel. And he came near to the going up of Beth-horon, and Judas went forth to meet him with a small company. And when they saw the army coming to meet them, they said to Judas, What? Shall we be able, being a small company, to fight against so great and strong a multitude? And we for our part are faint, having tasted no food this day. And Judas said, It is an easy thing for many to be shut up in the hands of a few, and with heaven it is all one to save by many or by few. For victory in battle stands not on the multitude of an army, but strength is from heaven. They come to us in fullness of insolence and lawlessness, to destroy us and our wives and our children, for to plunder us. But we fight for our lives and our laws, and he himself will discomfort them before our face. But as for you, be you not afraid of them. Now when he had left off speaking, he leaped suddenly upon them, and Sauron and his army were discomfited before him. And they pursued them in the going down of Beth-horon to the plain. And there fell of them about 800 men, but the residue fled into the land of the Philistines. And the fear of Judas and his kindred, and the dread of them, began to fall upon the nations round about them. And his name came near even to the king, and every nation told of the battles of Judas. And when King Ahasuerus heard these words, he was full of indignation, and he sent and gathered together all the forces of his realm, an exceedingly strong army. And he opened his treasury, and gave his forces pay for a year, and commanded them to be ready for every need. And he saw that the money failed from his treasures, and that the tributes of the country were small, because of the dissension and plague which he had brought upon the land, to the end that he might take away the laws which had been from the first days. And he feared that he should not have enough, as at other times, for the charges and the gifts which he gave aforetime with a liberal hand. And he abounded above the kings that were before him. And he was exceedingly perplexed in his mind. And he determined to go into Persia, and to take the tributes of the countries, and to gather much money. And he left Laius, an honourable man, and one of the seed royal, to be over the affairs of the king from the river Euphrates to the borders of Egypt, and to bring up his son Antiochus until he came again. And he delivered to him the half of his horses and the elephants, and he gave him charge of all things that he would have done. And concerning those who lived in Judea and in Jerusalem, that he should send an army against them, to root out and destroy the strength of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem, and to take away their immoral from the place, and that he should make strangers to dwell on all their coasts, and should divide their land to them by lot. And the king took the half that remained of the forces, and removed from Antiochus, from his royal city, the 147th year, and he passed over the river Euphrates, and went through the upper countries. And Lysias chose Ptolemy the son of Dorymenes, and Nicanor, and Gorgias, mighty men of the king's friends, and with them he sent 40,000 footmen and 7,000 horse, to go into the land of Judah and to destroy it, according to the word of the king. And they removed with their army, and came and pitched near to Emmaus, in the plain country. And the merchants of the country heard the fame of them, and took silver and gold exceedingly much, with fetters, and came into the camp to take the children of Israel for servants. And there were added to them the forces of Syria and of the land of the Philistines. And Judas and his kindred saw that evils were multiplied, and that the forces were encamping in their borders, and they took knowledge of the king's words, which he had commanded, to destroy the people and make the end of them. And they said each man to his neighbour, Let's raise up the ruin of our people, and let's fight for our people and the holy place. And the congregation was gathered together, that they might be ready for battle, and that they might pray and ask for mercy and compassion. And Jerusalem was without inhabitant, as a wilderness. There was none of the offspring that went in or went out, and the sanctuary was trodden down, and the sons of strangers were in the citadel. The Gentiles lodged therein, and joy was taken away from Jacob, and the pipe and the harp ceased. And they gathered themselves together, and came to Mizpah, near Jerusalem. For in Mizpah was there a place of prayer aforetime for Israel, and they fasted that day, and put on sackcloth, and put ashes upon their heads, and tore their clothes, and laid open the book of the law, concerning which the Gentiles were wont to acquire, seeking the likenesses of their idols. And they brought the priest's garments, and the first fruits, and the tithes, and they stirred up the Nazarites, who had accomplished their days. And they cried aloud toward heaven, saying, What shall we do with these men, and where shall we carry them away? And your holy place is trodden down and profaned, and your priests are in heaviness and brought low. And behold, the Gentiles are assembled together against us to destroy us. You know what things they imagine against us. How shall we be able to stand before them, except you be our help? And they sounded with the trumpets, and cried with a loud voice. And after this Judas appointed leaders of the people, captains of thousands, and captains of hundreds, and captains of fifties, and captains of tens. And he said to those who were building houses, and were betrothing wives, and were planting vineyards, and were fearful, that they should return, each man to his own house, according to the law. And the army removed and encamped upon the south side of Emmaus. And Judas said, Gird yourselves, and be valiant men, and be in readiness against the morning, that you may fight with these Gentiles, that are assembled together against us to destroy us, and our holy place. For it is better for us to die in battle, than to look upon the evils of our nation and the holy place. Nevertheless, as may be the will in heaven, so shall we do. And Gorgias took 5,000 footmen, and 1,000 chosen horse, and the army removed by night, that it might fall upon the army of the Jews and strike them suddenly. And the men of the citadel were his guides. And Judas heard thereof, and removed, he and the valiant men, that he might strike the king's army which was at Emmaus, while as yet the forces were dispersed from the camp. And Gorgias came into the camp of Judas by night, and found no man. And he sought them in the mountains. For he said, These men flee from us. And as soon as it was day, Judas appeared on the plain with 3,000 men. However, they had not armour nor swords to their minds. And they saw the camp of the Gentiles strong and fortified, and horsemen compassing it round about. And these were expert in war. And Judas said to the men that were with him, Be you not their multitude, neither be you afraid of their onset. Remember how our fathers were saved in the Red Sea, when Pharaoh pursued them with an army. And now let's cry to heaven, if he will have us, and remember the covenant of our fathers, and destroy this army before our face today. And all the Gentiles shall know that there is one who redeems and saves Israel. And the strangers lifted up their eyes, and saw them coming near them. And they went out of the camp to battle, and those who were with Judas sounded their trumpets, and joined battle, and the Gentiles were discomfited, and fled into the plain. But all the hindmost fell by the sword, and they pursued them to Gazarah, and to the plains of Idumea, and Azotus, and Jamnia, and there fell of them about 3,000 men. And Judas and his army returned from pursuing after them. And he said to the people, Be not greedy of the spoils, inasmuch as there is a battle before us, and Gorgias and his army are near to us in the mountain. But stand you now against our enemies, and fight against them, and afterwards take the spoils with boldness. While Judas was yet making an end of these words, there appeared a part of them looking out from the mountain. And they saw that their army had been put to flight, and that the Jews were burning the camp, for the smoke that was seen declared what was done. But when they perceived these things, they were sore afraid, and perceiving also the arm of Judas in the plain ready for battle. And they all fled, all of them, into the land of the Philistines. And Judas returned to the plunder of the camp. And they got much gold, and silver, and blue, and sea purple, and great riches. And they returned home, and sang a song of thanksgiving, and gave praise to heaven, because his mercy is good, because his mercy endures forever. And Israel had a great deliverance that day. But the strangers, as many had escaped, came and told Lysias all the things that had happened. When he heard thereof, he was confounded and discouraged, because neither had such things as he would have been done to Israel, nor had such things as the king commanded him come to pass. And in the next year he gathered together 70,000 chosen footmen, and 5,000 horse, that he might subdue them. And they came into Idumea, and encamped at Bethsura. And Judas met them with 10,000 men. And he saw that the army was strong, and he prayed, and said, Blessed are you, O Saviour of Israel, who did quell the onset of the mighty men by the hand of your servant David, and did deliver the army of the Philistines into the hands of Jonathan, the son of Saul, and of his armor-bearer, and shut up this army in the hand of your people Israel, and let them be ashamed for their army and their horsemen. Give them faintness of heart, and cause the boldness of their strength to melt away, and let them quake at their destruction. Cast them down with the sword of those who love you, and let all that know your name praise you with thanksgiving. And they joined battle, and there fell of the army of Lysias about 5,000 men, and they fell down near them. But when Lysias saw that his array was put to flight, and the boldness that had come upon those who were with Judas, and how they were ready either to live or to die nobly, he removed to Antiochus, and gathered together hired soldiers, that he might come again into Judea with an even greater company. And Judas and his kindred said, Behold, our enemies are discomfited,